we gotta talk about the Apple One chip, because the Apple One chip is really, really interesting for a few reasons. But I think one of the bigger things that makes it a really interesting proposition is how Qualcomm and other Android manufacturers might respond to it. You see that we have for the way computers, processors, stuff like that is set up. It all comes from kind of the way computers like came from these huge, large, like one room things. The main processing unit takes care of processing stuff. The graphics card takes care of processing stuff for graphics. But a lot of the advancement and a lot of the technology that we see that's pushing graphics cards forward is coming for gaming, and coming specifically for gaming and things like ray tracing. And in a lot of ways, that's really, really good for gaming. And stuff on the x86 platform is great, and we're seeing huge advancements from companies like AMD. But for Apple to engineer a mobile first processor means that Apple is trying to fulfill and basically satisfy all of the mobile processing needs, or all of the needs that a user in 2020 has, without necessarily acknowledging any of the legacy like aspects of computing. Because in some ways, a company like AMD is being restrained in regards to what they can do, because if they were to create a radically new thing, there would be a slowness in adoption, and overall, unless AMD wants to kind of change the way we think of computing, they're going to be at a loss for a long period of time. If you're new to these podcasts, I like to talk about a specific subject, we go into it, and I release all of these podcasts on my podcast audio channel first. You guys can go ahead and subscribe on Google Podcasts or on SoundCloud. And I normally post these podcasts 3 to 4 days before I release them in video form. But Apple isn't necessarily constrained by any of this, because they are such a hegemonic force, such a monopoly in the space of mobile computing. They can do this and have relatively quick and fast adoption rate by developers and consumers. What this also means is that Apple can essentially introduce this new chip, this new form of computing, and ensure that the user experience for early adopters, it might be rocky for a couple of months, but because Apple is such a hegemonic force and developers see that the industry is moving towards this M1 chip, essentially they can optimize for that experience really quickly, and they're incentivized to do that. Now, what Apple's done with this M1 chip is they've taken the architecture and everything that they've learned from their mobile processing, which is essentially different processors for different tasks, so that they can either all work at the same time, or they can boost up one of these clock speeds to accomplish a specific single-threaded goal. And all of this means that they're able to generate less heat, use less electricity, because they have this chip architectured for the needs of most consumers, instead of creating chips and then having those chips then be adopted by consumers, and consumers having to tailor their usage around them, or I should say developers. They don't have to do that. They can develop the chip for the way the consumer uses it, not the consumer has to change the way they use the chip. Another really, really, really interesting thing that I want to point out is that Apple was one of the first mobile companies to adopt the H.265 compression, and they're able to give you better video quality, smaller files, but because of that, you have to decode then these larger files. And by and large, a lot of that is done on Android phones or even on regular PCs at the CPU level, which means that your graphics card isn't being optimized for it, and it's taking away from the overall computational power you have left for other things. But because Apple is creating this piece of silicon specifically for users, they can have all of this H.265 decoding and encoding done specifically on the graphics card or the graphics GPU that's built into the chip. And that graphics unit is engineered and designed specifically for the H.265 codec. And what that means is that a codec that would normally be very, very intense for a regular PC to operate with flies on the M1 chip, which is why for a lot of creative professionals, a chip like this is really, really appealing. And it's why we're seeing a lot of these benchmark numbers and a lot of this performance for video rendering and for video encoding and decoding on these new Apple M1 chips. Now the Apple M1 chip and all these other newer chips that we see, those are all based on the ARM architecture, which is a mobile first processing architecture for CPUs, GPUs, system on chips. Now, this ARM architecture has always been associated with lower power and inferior performance to x86 or to the conventional architecture of CPUs. This is something that's kind of complex and difficult to explain. But essentially, Apple is breaking the mold with the way that they're making these chips on this specific architecture. This is interesting because, at least in regards to computational horsepower, we're seeing the Snapdragon 865 getting close to the Apple A14 Bionic, or at least the Apple A13. And we're expecting to see the Snapdragon 875 as well as the Exynos 10 series come out with really, really high synthetic benchmarks. The only problem is that kids crying, we're moving. The only problem with this is what's the operating system going to be if we have these powerful ARM chips on laptops? Is it going to be Windows? Well, Windows has been trying to introduce the Windows for ARM for a while with very mixed results, especially in regards to adoption from developers. There aren't a lot of Windows applications that have been ported to ARM yet. That's on the development side of things, though. What about Android? Well, what about Android? We've already seen Google abandon Android on tablets or Android on large Surface devices with the introduction of Chrome OS. And I did a podcast about that, link to that video up here. And if you're in the podcast form, that would be my previous podcast. But essentially, Google has decided that Chrome OS is going to be the future of mobile computing from Google on large form factor devices. So the reality of this is that we have a lot going against there being any kind of competition from Windows, from Google. At least on the Windows side of things, we've seen zero adoption or very minimal adoption for Windows on ARM. The ARM would be the necessary architecture for these mobile first chipsets. So we have the hardware side of things being the lack of chips from Qualcomm or another ARM company that compete with anything like what we have from Apple. On the other side, we also have the development and the user experience side of things because we don't have very much in the way of applications that have been ported for ARM yet. And so because of this, we see Apple has a huge advantage, and Apple is so far ahead of the competition, not even, holy shit, a Go. A Go.
No. This is my Go. You can buy it off me for $2 million.
I'm sure it's delicious. I just don't know what I would do with it. Other than potentially eat
it. Is she pregnant? Her belly's really big.
And to me, it's just It's just crazy how far and ahead Apple is on all this. It's enough to make me hold off on building a computer for the next couple months, because depending on what we have from Apple in regards to a higher end version of this chip, I might consider buying an Apple laptop, because at least for my needs, which is 4K video editing, performance of this should be pretty good in a size that's really small at a price that's quite reasonable. If I don't want to build myself another PC, I'm definitely not going to buy another PC laptop. I mean, prior to this, I was thinking about getting the Asus Zephyrus G14. It comes with Ryzen 7, 8 cores, RTX 2060. There's a couple other AMD based laptops.
Hello.
I was gonna say ciao ciao, but they're not Vietnamese. Long story short, I'm definitely not going to buy a Windows laptop. I might build a desktop, or I might try to buy something used, but Apple has done so much in regards to just shaking up the market with the development of this chipset that it's changed kind of what I would expect out of the next laptop I purchase. And it's kind of difficult for me to think about buying another, it's difficult for me to think of buying another laptop right now from a Windows manufacturer. I was gonna start cursing at these kids in Vietnamese, it just doesn't work. Literally,